Dan Bulk, and this is Bob Lightfoot, and welcome to Make a Plan with Bob and Dan, the first episode in a series of videos regarding legal and regulatory issues facing assisted living providers, senior housing, and skilled nursing facilities. I'm an associate in Reinhardt's Healthcare Practice Group, and Bob is a shareholder.
I'm also a registered nurse.
Yes, and this episode is on resident recording and granny cams. This is a hot topic issue for DHS currently, and we are going to talk through a few of the state and federal issues that providers face whenever a resident is recorded. So Bob, obviously there's federal privacy laws and state privacy laws. Can you give us kind of a quick rundown of what's implicated here?
Sure. First, there's HIPAA. Everyone has concerns with HIPAA privacy these days, so that's kind of the overriding one. Probably more importantly, though, is that the state privacy rights are very important, especially important to the Department of Health Services at this time. They're very concerned with resident privacy rights, so that's kind of overarching over all of this granny cam issue. So we have to be very particular. As you know, we have resident rights in a variety of areas, not only just every regulatory category, CBRF, adult family home, and RCAC, but even in our statute we have that privacy right. And DHS holds that very dear here in Wisconsin. That may not be the case in other states, but particularly in Wisconsin, they're concerned with privacy. The only other thing is in the CBRF regulations, we have that resident right not to be filmed or recorded without consent. So, I think you can broaden that out to all regulatory categories, but it is written in the CBRF regs.
Right. So what are a few instances where these privacy rights would actually be implicated?
Well, with regard to granny cams, particularly if someone wants to come in and do a camera in a resident room, a family member would want to do that, or just a resident wants to be filmed, or if a facility wants to film a resident for any particular reason. Those are really kind of the range of ways that these policies and these privacy rights can come into play.
Right, and of course that's not just only when a resident wants to be filmed or when a facility is filming a resident specifically, but also whenever they're recording anywhere inside or outside of the facility, these rights are implicated.
That's right, Dan. And in fact, there are areas where actually filming would be permitted. And so that would include areas such as parking lot, offices in a facility, medication storage room, anywhere where you're not going to see residents. So prohibited areas would include common areas, dining room, and I will tell you, in accordance with the guidance that DHS has put out in DQA Memo 0016, which I urge the audience to Google and find, that DHS would go so far as to prohibit cameras in resident rooms, period. So that is really pretty strict, but that gives you an idea of just how important the privacy rights of residents are and how those are going to be protected by DHS here in Wisconsin.
Right, and of course that guidance wasn't an outright prohibition.
No, it's not a complete prohibition. There are instances where it could be permitted. So if the treatment, for instance, requires that, it's going to be rare, obviously, but if that would require it. If a competent resident wants to be filmed, if the daughter says, hey, my mom says she wants a camera in the room, can she have one? Generally, that should be permitted, although here again is where probably the lawyers can help, because if you don't have a policy on camera use or granny cams in general, it would be good to have one, because then you can whip that out and say to the family member, hey, look, this is DHS's position on this. You can also whip out that DQA memo. This is how DHS feels, and therefore this is the parameters we put around that policy and the restrictions and the prohibitions of use. For instance, you wouldn't want even a family member watching a resident be bathed, would you? You wouldn't want even a family member to see a resident be toileted. Those sorts of things are just not things that should be filmed. And so there have to be some reasonable restrictions that will go into a policy. And certainly we've drafted policies for clients before.
Right. Yes, and obviously this DHS takes a fairly strict view on recording. Is not necessarily so bad to facilities. It's not necessarily the worst thing to happen.
No, because if you think about it, really upholding resident rights, which is a top citation these days, resident rights, that is something that's actually favorable to the facilities and the providers, right? I mean, if DHS says we shouldn't have cameras, that's good for you. That's good for business that we restrict that, because, you know, we wouldn't want wholesale use of granny cams. I mean, I've seen other states that have granny cam statutes, and some are pretty permissive. I think it's a good thing that we don't have that, and that we actually are more strongly protecting resident rights here in Wisconsin.
Right, but at the same time, some facilities might want to allow granny cams, given the fact that so many residents would request them, and fighting over admissions of private pay residents. Some facilities might want a more permissive policy, which we've drafted those as well.
Right, but all the more reason to have a policy period.
Right, and that helps the operations people who may not necessarily be in the discussions with us when we tell the administrator or CEO exactly what the law is on the topic.
That's right.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Join us in the next episode of Make a Plan with Bob and Dan.